Hello, my minnow friends. This is Menopause Taylor bringing you the state of menopause in the world today. And I'm so glad you've come back for more information on heart attack. I'm giving you an entire unit on heart attack. And would you believe this heart attack unit encompasses 26 podcasts in all? Why so many? Because heart attack is by far the greatest risk for the majority of women. So I'm making sure that you know everything. And eventually, I'll be giving you a whole unit on every single disease associated with menopause and menopausal women, because this is the key to understanding. And if you happen to have my book, the entire the entire chapter of 28, chapter 28 is all on heart attack. And if you'd like to get the book and follow along the podcast, the two go together very, very, very well. So today's podcast is on something called risk calculators for heart attack. Now, why should you listen to this podcast? Well, if you've never heard of risk calculators, you should listen. If you've heard of them but you don't know what they are, you should listen. And if you know what they are but don't know how or why doctors use them, you should listen. Because you know what? Knowledge is power. And in this case, it's what I like to call minnow power. So just listen. In the last podcast, I gave you a great big list of all the risk factors for a heart attack. And it consisted of 15 items. And you learned that each and every one of them has a bearing on your risk for heart attack. The list included being postmenopausal, having a previous heart attack yourself, smoking, high lousy LDL, low healthy HDL, a total to HDL ratio of greater than 4, high triglycerides, obesity, a fat abdomen, high blood pressure, diabetes, a sedentary lifestyle, gum disease, a high homocysteine level, depression, and a family history of heart attack. Now, some of those factors are more significant for women than others. But just knowing this list of risk factors enables you to assess how many of the factors are risks for you. So that's great for individualizing both your risk and your management in order to decrease your risk of heart attack. But in addition to, or instead of this list, some doctors use risk calculators. Risk calculators are estimators. They are designed to gauge your chances of having a heart attack, and they are essentially mathematical formulas. They involve filling in your particulars for a few questions and ending up with a score called your risk score. And your risk score tells you how likely it is that you will have a heart attack over a certain period of time, which is usually 10 to 30 years. And doctors use risk calculators to determine who is most likely to benefit from preventive measures like diet, lifestyle changes, or medications. But the key to these risk calculators is that although you put in your specific information, all you get is a numerical estimate of risk. Now, I know that sounds really nifty, but there are limitations and inadequacies with risk calculators. The first problem is that most people don't even understand the meaning of the word risk. Now, you know me. I explain everything. Remember, I just said that a risk calculator tells you your risk of having a heart attack within a certain period of time? So let's dissect that a bit. Let's say you calculate your risk for a heart attack, and the risk calculator gives you a risk of 10%. there are different ways to interpret that 10%. One is the epidemiologic risk. That big word just means that it pertains to the entire population rather than to you individually. So an epidemiologic risk of 10% means that for 100 people with a 10% risk, 10 will have a heart attack over the next decade. So this interpretation of risk may help in planning prevention and treatment for an entire population, but not for you individually. You may or may not be one of the 10 who has a heart attack. 90 of those 100 people will not have a heart attack. The other way to interpret 10% risk is to apply it to yourself personally. In other words, you have a 10% risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years. But it also means that you have a 90% chance of not having a heart attack over the next 10 years. No risk calculator tells you specifically if you will or won't have a heart attack. They only tell you your probability of having a heart attack. And the long time frame they cover makes people lazy about making changes that will reduce the risk. So let me tell you how risk calculators came about, and then I'll tell you about some different risk calculators that are available. In 1992, a study was done in Framingham, Massachusetts, and it assessed 5,200 patients to determine their risk for a heart attack. Now, while 5,200 sounds like a big number, it constitutes only a medium-sized study group. And in devising a numerical risk probability for heart attack, the researchers developed something called the Framingham Risk Score. Now, in the last podcast and earlier today, I mentioned the 15 risk factors for heart attack. Well, the Framingham Risk Score did not take all 15 factors into account. Instead, it only included 7 of them. It has been modified twice, once in 2002 and once in 2008, but it still only accounts for about half of the risk factors. And generally speaking, this and other risk calculators tend to underestimate the risk for women, especially those who are at moderate risk. But women at moderate risk are the very ones who can benefit the most from intervention. As the Framingham risk calculator appeared, others started popping up, which of course is always typical. And one is called the Reynolds Risk Score. Unlike the Framingham Risk Score, it includes family history and markers of inflammation. And another risk calculator is the Atherosclerosis Cardiovascular Disease Risk Assessment Tool, or ASCVD. But it's limited to use for people between the ages of only 40 and 75. If you're over 75, too bad. Still another is the Multi-Ethnic Risk Assessment, or MESA. And now that technology is so prevalent, you can go online and find all sorts of risk calculators. The problem is that they will all give you different results, some markedly different. I actually tried it. Here's what I did. I put the same data into 5 different risk calculators. None of the data was extreme. I just made up some values, including all the following. I gave an age of 59, a blood pressure of 140/90 on no medications, a cholesterol of 220, an HDL of 40, an LDL greater than 130, diabetes type 2, non-smoker, and positive family history. Now, not all the risk calculators asked for all those pieces of data. But that's the data I used for all of them. And here's what I got. The results were risk scores ranging from 3.4% to 24% for having a heart attack in the next 10 years. I got all the following scores. I got 3.4%, 9.1%, 10%, 21.4%, and 24%. So with all these different risk calculators and all their different risk scores, it's really difficult to make much sense out of them. And remember, your doctor may just use only one of these. And depending on the one he or she uses, it may or may not say you're at risk. So if your doctor uses your risk score to determine whether or not to advise diet and lifestyle changes or whether or not to offer you preventive medication, it can have a huge impact on your health. Another layer of this, insurance. What if your insurance will only approve a lipid-lowering medication if you have a certain threshold risk score? That could keep you from getting what you need. So these risk calculators are nifty, and everyone's thrilled with technological gadgets. But what you really want is to know your actual risk for a heart attack. And all this variability makes it difficult for you to know that. Another problem with risk calculators is that the factors that are most prominent change over time, while the risk calculator stays the same. For instance, when the first risk calculators were developed, type 2 diabetes was extremely rare. But now it's ubiquitous. Even children have type 2 diabetes. And back when the Framingham study took place, smoking was very common. Nowadays, it's not nearly as common. And another problem is that while your personal data that you plug into the risk calculator may not change much, you could adopt a much healthier lifestyle and decrease your risk significantly, but the risk calculator may not reflect that. Or you could change doctors and get a completely different risk score simply because he or she uses a different calculator. Or your current doctor could start using a different risk calculator. If you weren't aware of all these nuances, you could be woefully misled in all sorts of ways. Personally, I prefer to know the entire list of risk factors, determine which ones apply to me, and do everything I can to improve them so that I lower my risk for a heart attack. I just think it's more important for you to know that these risk calculators exist, that there are many of them, and that they do not agree with one another in determining your risk. And not only that, the risk scores they give you are only a probability. Sometimes it's just better to do things the good old-fashioned way by figuring things out for yourself. This sort of reminds me of what it was like when calculators first became available. You know, I'm old. We had to learn how to do all calculations in our head when I was in school. I remember memorizing multiplication tables, algebraic expressions, trigonomic identities, calculus derivatives, and all sorts of mathematical things. They're still in my head to this day. Pi is 3.1416. And when calculators first appeared, we were forbidden from using them. And as a nerd, I've always preferred doing all my mathematical problems the long way. I want to demonstrate every single step. That's part of the fun for me. But over time, everyone had a calculator. And because everyone had one, nobody memorized any of those mathematical tables anymore. And school kids were convinced